Where were you born?
I was born in Rockford, Iowa, right here. I was born out on a farm, rural Floyd County, just northwest of Rockford. And then we moved into town when I was 1 year old, on a little acreage on the southeast edge of town down here. And then I went to the Rockford, school system. And after school, I began my work out on an agriculture thing, farm stuff and that kind of things. And then I got hired by the Brick and Tile in 1951, August of 51. And that's where I ended up working for a number of years, 22 years to be exact, at the Rockford Brick and Tile.
So what was your job?
Well, starting out, I was just a day labor type person, and there was many different kinds of jobs with the Brick and Tile, such as unloading the kilns, loading box cars, stacking the drain tile, loading trucks, which they didn't have a lot in them days. They had box cars. We loaded a lot of box car stuff out of here, the drain tile and the brick. And so then, after about 6 months of that or less, I worked in the mill room. And the mill room was a location of the plant where they made the greenware. The stuff come out of the pits and was ground up and run through a pug mill and extruded out. So I worked in the mill room for a while. And then after a little time of that, they needed somebody down in the pits to run a locomotive to haul the stuff out of the pits. So I ran a little so-called narrow gauge locomotive railroad train engine with a hydraulic kind of a dump car on it, and my job was to take that down to the pit. They had a hopper system set up down there, and you pulled the lever and the product came out into the car, and I drove the locomotive up to the plant and dumped it, and that's what they ground up and they made the brick and the tile out of. And so eventually that old locomotive got to be kind of obsolete, so they went to dump trucks. And so I drove a dump truck, brand new Ford dump truck. Boy, I thought I had a really good piece of equipment at that time. And I ran that for a short time, and then they put me on the road hauling drain tile and brick, delivering out to the areas all over Iowa. We went into Minnesota, Dakota, hauled stuff back out of Missouri, little stuff. But most of our drain tile, as far as the drain tile itself, I would say the bulk of that, 80% of that probably went in a circle around Iowa City. If you was to draw a circle around Iowa City of about 140 miles each way and around, that's where we hauled most of our drain tile out around. A lot of it went around up in here too, but we hauled a lot of it to the southeast of here is where it went. And so after a number of years of driving truck, I drove that until 1972. Then I left the brick and tile at that time and went to work on a different job. So that was my years at the brick and tile plant anyway. Yeah.
How many hours a week did you work?
We started out working I believe it was 48 hours a week. And we started at 7:30 in the morning. You was off a half an hour for lunch, and you was off at 3:30 in the afternoon. I think that's, and there was overtime offered, of course, if they needed it. And I started out at 79 cents an hour. That was my base pay. And that eventually, they had a new manager that came in by the name of Paul Galvin, and he started a bonus plan, they called it. If you got so much tonnage out based on how many man hours that was inside the plant used, man hours used against, the weight of the stuff out, then you got a bonus. So all of a sudden I was making like 47 cents an hour more based on that. What they wanted to gear up the production, And so that's how that went. And you just didn't have no insurance to speak of. You had workman's insurance offered to you, but outside of that, that's all. There was a lot of injuries, you broken fingers and pinched fingers and that type of stuff went on, A lot of labor intensive. Everything was done by hand. Lifting, lugging, loading, everything was all hand work. Wheelbarrows, you know, and wheeled the product. And it was a lot of labor to it, and hot in the summer, and cold in the winter. Yep.
When you were down around the Kilns, was that even more hot down there?
It was really hot around the kilns because they were, when you emptied them out, they were in the process of giving up their heat, you know. So the heat was drafted out the bottom and drawn back into the little tunnels underneath, and they used that heat out of them for the dryer, what they called the dryer, to dry the wear. So, but we always had big air fans that you would stick in, and my job was really not to go in the kilns. That was another job. And when I was driving truck, my job was just to bring the truck up by the kilns, and we had roller conveyors and rolled the stuff out on conveyors, and we had to take them, load them on the truck, and deliver the stuff. But they had other guys that went in the kiln, and that was a hot job, very mean job. And that, a lot of times when you got the stuff out of it, it was too hot, you know, to handle with your bare hands. You couldn't grab a hold of it with your bare hands. It was that hot. So, yeah.
How did your job kind of change with the seasons during the year?
It was kind of seasonal. When you hauled drain tile out, it was in, you know, the spring of the year. The ground was kind of soft and that, so it was hard to deliver the drain tile out to, you know, the agriculture areas because it was muddy and soft. But, you know, it basically, you did it, you know, you stacked it in the piles, and then they had to haul it around in different ways, to, you know, to get it out on the farms where they wanted it. In the seasons, the winter time, that was the kind of the dead time, and I usually volunteer to work maintenance during the winter time, overhaul the trucks and work on the trucks and do that kind of stuff. And there was other jobs to do, and then during the winter time they would stockpile, you know, manufacture and stockpile it and get it ready to go out the next season, you know.
Okay.
Yep.
So there wasn't really any production during the winter though?
Yes, they did. In order to run in the winter, you know, it was cold out, so down in the, you know, the clay pits, they had to hang a big old canvas over the bank to keep it from nighttime. It would get cold and freeze up, and these knives that they dug, you know, the clay with off the vertical bank, that would get hard and freeze, so they would hang a big old canvas over the bank and stretch it out, and then they put heat underneath. Burners, they called them salamander burners, diesel fuel they burned, or heating fuel, and they put 6 or 7 of them under the canvas and light them, and then it heated that and held it hot. And in the mornings you'd have to go down and roll up the canvas, which was a hard job. You had to climb up the big boom and gather up the ropes and reel in the canvas and hang it on the side there, and then they went ahead and dug the clay. So then they could manufacture during the winters, but they never used to early on. But later on, when the demand for the drain tile got high, they had to have the product to sell, so they had to get it made and get it in the yard and get it ready to ship. So, you know, some winters they did work all winters. Yeah, yeah.
So were you around when they put in the tunnel kills?
I was here when they did that, yes. Mm-hmm.
How did that change things?
It was supposed to eliminate all the Beehive kills eventually, but it never really got into production enough to hardly do that. They had lots of problems with it. It did a pretty good job most of the time, but there was lots of problems with that, you know, the tunnel kill. It would jam up inside, you know. It was a hydraulic system that would shove the cars down through the tunnel kill, and the stuff was lined up on rails, and it would go down real slow. On this end of it, you know, when it went in, it was greenware, of course, but it was dried, so they had to bring the heat up kind of gradually. So as it went down inside the tunnel kill, it'd get hotter and hotter and into the high heat zone, and then out the cooling zone, and then eventually loaded out of there, you know. But yeah, I was here, but it was a lot of work, and they had a lot of waste material and stuff out of that. Yeah.
What did they do with waste?
It was just pure junk. You just hauled it to a big, just down in there and dumped it in the piles, and it was re-hauled back out. A lot of people came and got it to dump it inside the cattle yards and, you know, mud spots and stuff where they wanted something for fill, you know. Yeah. Yep.
So you talked a little about injuries and accidents. Was there anything really major that happened while you lived
Well,
there?
before I began to work out there, there was one man lost his life inside the plant. He was working back by what's the hammer mill, they called it, where they ground up the clay, and somehow or another he was back there up higher than working on something, lost his hold and lost his life there. There were other incidents, broken bones, a few, and smashed fingers, cuts. Everything moved, the cars that went down through there holding the wear, they would jam against each other and somebody get their hand in the wrong place and something would fall and that. But, all in all, it wasn't too bad. I mean, every place has injuries, to a certain degree,
So you talked a little bit about, changing machinery while you were there. Is there anything else that kind of came with that?
I think the biggest change in the industry was the energy. They burned coal when I started there, and then they eventually went to natural gas, and then they had a backup bottle, big old bottle of LP gas. And so the energy thing was the main change in it. The tunnel kill was the other change. The loss of the railroad in here was another big change, because they used to load a lot of the cars out here, box cars. So when the bridge went bad down here, so they lost, the railroad. They didn't want to, I don't know what it was, but for some reason they didn't want to update the bridge, fix it. So they went to semis, and they leased in 65, I believe it was, they leased a bunch of diesel trucks from Rouen, and most everything after that went by road, That was a big change.
So when they lost the railroad, did they just truck it up to the depot if they wanted to set things up?
No, they trucked everything out of here at that time. Most everything went, no more railroad, yeah.
Did that kind of slow things down?
No, it really didn't, but I'm sure it added to the cost of, delivering the goods and so forth. But at that time, the railroads were beginning, about that same time, the railroads were losing out majorly anyway to semi-traffic, Everybody wanted their stuff almost the day they ordered, of course, and the railroad, was unable to do it that way because it had to be loaded out and switched here and down here, and by the time they got it delivered, somebody had to come to the rail yard and unload the cars and haul it again, and a lot of handling went on with that. This way you put it on a truck, you deliver it right to the job site, and that was nice,
Were you around for the strike?
I was here when they went on strike, absolutely, yeah.
So what was that all about?
It was mostly about benefits, you might say, the wage level, and you got to understand, everybody wanted more money, always have, always will, but you have to have a balance between who you're getting it from and who's taking it, so they keep on manufacturing, I was a union member at that time. We felt that we was entitled to a little bit more, even if they had to charge more for what they were selling to make up the difference. I mean, because the whole country was expanding and going, agriculture was beginning the boom years out there. They went from raising animals on the farms and having the family farm where everybody, took part. They went to row cropping, and more rows of, the corn, beans, less hay, and so, there was a demand. So we kind of felt at that time that we should be in on it also a little bit. And that's, the government was involved in agriculture, subsidizing, the drain tiling of the fields. And in those days, I think the government actually compensated them for about half.
Really?
For getting drain tile in the ground and putting new land into production. We were told in agriculture at that time that we had to feed the world, so we were gearing up for it, And so that's why we thought we should have a little more too for what we were doing,
How did that end up ending?
It ended up okay. We ended up with a little increase, and it wasn't a whole lot in them days, but it meant a lot to us, you know. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about your pay. Was that considered pretty good at that time?
For the area here, no, it really wasn't. Oliver was paying more, Deckers was paying more, other plants were giving more. The beauty of it is it was near home, you know, and it means quite a little bit if you don't have to drive. Mm-hmm. Looking at it today, it would mean a whole lot if you didn't have to drive, you know, with the energy cost and so forth. So, no, it was good for the area, it was good for the town. All these little businesses were good for the towns, good for Main Street, USA. Main Street used to sell out of Main Street what the surrounding area bought. But as agriculture areas, certain entities in agriculture died out, they didn't need those things. You didn't need the creameries, you didn't need everything that you know, the agriculture needed and what they was offering. So you could see the big change when it went to row crop out there, you know, then, but the drain tile business was good at that time from the 60s, the 70s, you know.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
When plastic tiling came in, and obviously that shut down the plant, what effect did that have on the local economy?
It had a lot to do with it. When you lose a business that are hiring that many people and you shut it down, and that's really the reason they had to shut down, I suppose, because, you know, the cost of production, the energy cost, drain tile, even building materials made a big change. They went from building blocks, you know, backup blocks and that kind of things that they build hospitals and warehouses and all kinds of stuff with that kind of blocks that they made here. The industry made a change in how they did things. They had to speed up their end of it. They put up, you know, fabricated buildings, imitation brick fronts. So the industry made a big change, and that had a bearing too on what Rockford was doing here in the brick and tile plant. Yeah.
Is that why they cut their brick line?
Well, they didn't make a whole lot of what we called real face brick. Exterior brick. They made a lot of backup stuff that went inside the walls that were, you know, covered up. We imported a lot of brick at the brick and tile. They brought, what I mean by importing, they brought in the early days, boxcars, loads of brick from other areas. Texas and other places where...
So they were more like the middleman.
Yeah, they was the middleman handling, you know, the brick, and so we would haul those brick and unload them out of boxcars, and then eventually, when they lost a railroad here, they would bring the boxcars into the nearby area where they sold the brick, and then we would go down there with the truck and unload them boxcars and haul it to the job sites, such as warehouses and hospitals and stuff like that. Mm-hmm.
Did the employees get along pretty well at work?
Basically, yes. Mm-hmm. Not saying there weren't some confrontations from time to time, you know. Roughshod old bunch. I got, you know, they were lean and mean. If you look at the pictures of the old brick and tile people, very difficult to find a overweight one in the bunch. Have you noticed that when you looked at the pictures? Yeah. I got mine out the other day, and I think when I started at the brickyard, I weighed like 140 some pounds, and I got down from sweat and so forth to I think 119 to 20 pounds. And it was just everybody was used to the work, and yeah, there was a little confrontation, a little fighting going on once in a while. I remember some of them. Yep.
Was there a lot of parties outside of work? Did you guys go out for beer sometimes after work?
Oh yeah, the beer taverns downtown, they usually caught a little bit, you know, right after work on a hot day, we'd get together down there and have a beer or two and discuss what went on and what ought to go on. You know how it is, for sure. Yeah.
What did it kind of mean around here to work at the brick and tile? Was it considered important, or was it?
I would say it was considered pretty important. I got to give the Galvins a lot of credit, the ones that run it. Grover Galvin, his relatives there, Paul Galvin. The brick business, the building business, the drain tile business, it was great. I think they did a great job for the area here. It provided a lot of jobs. I got along really well with them. I didn't have no bad at times with the management and so forth, except, we went on strike. We thought we should have a little bit more pay, but that was the only time when, the feelings got a little hot and heavy, but that's just the way it goes, and everybody pretty much got over it. And yes, I think the area around here needed that business, and as we lose these business, we lose out, Yep.
What was the best thing about this job?
Money. Earning a living. That's the best thing there was the payday. It is with everybody. Everybody's got to have enough to earn enough, and if you can earn it near home, it's a lot better, Nowadays we turn the key and drive miles, and the energy cost, it's taking a hunk out of everything. It's costing the country. In the old days, they used to build a factory and build the houses around the factory. Now the factories are way off in Timbuktu, and we drive to them, and it was a lot better in the old days as far as that end of it. You could spend more time at home. Yeah, instead of out driving.
So how did a lot of the guys get to work? They were mostly from Rockford.
They were mostly from around here, although there was some around the area that lived out on farms. Some lived in North Springs. Some come over from Charles City. I got married and moved to Mason, so I drove from Mason down here to work for a while, until I bought a house in Rockford. But we used to pool, the car, and we'd change off every week, and we'd carry so much, and get $1 a week from each one of them, to pick them up. $1 a week is all it was, and so he'd drive this week, next guy drive next week. And when you broke down and you couldn't get to work, you could walk. I mean, it was only like 1.5 miles out here, or less than a mile, coming down the railroad track, so it really wasn't, all that big a deal to just walk to work or run to work if you wanted to, Yeah.
What was the worst thing about working out here?
Well, the worst thing was probably the wear and tear on your body, and your clothes, your hands, your glove, your feet. You wore out lots of clothes. You wore out a lot of shoes, gloves. It really wasn't a bad thing, because at that time you really didn't realize what all the good things was. That job was a job, and you really didn't even stop looking back. You think about it. But at the time, I didn't really look at it as, it was a learning thing too. For me, I was young, right out of high school, and you learned as you went. You learned a lot of things, and how to repair things and do things and work with your hands, and basically how to get along with other people too. You learn that real young when you start out here young. Yeah.
So after you graduated high school, you came straight out here then?
Well, I didn't graduate. I quit early, I'll be honest with you. I had a little confrontation with the high school superintendent, and that wasn't a very good deal. And I took it on myself to iron that out. I should have taken the whole works in with me, but I didn't. But I walked in. But I went back and got my education. I went to NIAC. I went and got my GED and got some things out of NIAC that I needed, night schools and stuff. So finished out real good.
So how old were you when you started out here?
I was like 18. Yeah. When I started school, I was just barely 5. So I was like 17 when I would have been out of school.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
What was the average age of the guy that worked out here? Was he young?
I would, looking back when I started here, the average age was not young. The war, at the wartime, there was women worked out here to replace the men, and there was some of them working out here yet when I started. Rhodey Fredericks, Susie Mayman was her maiden name. I think she was a Kingery at that time. Yeah, Susie Kingery. The average age, I would say, at that time would probably have been 50, 45 to 50. A lot of elderly people worked out here.
Was that kind of because of the war? There just weren't enough young guys?
Yeah, I think so. I think that when the war ended, and I started out here in 51, and the war ended like in 45, 46 in there. And they didn't come back out to here. I think that's the reason that a lot of them old guys had been out here a long time, Yeah.
Did that ever change as you worked out here?
Maybe some, but not very many kids got out of school and went to work here, or they went on, going to college. Some of them stayed here, some of them worked a while and didn't like it, went over to other jobs, for more money, more pay, and, I think the average age kind of stayed high. I think it wasn't a young group, no. That's the production building. That's where they, had the machinery inside of there. This building is a let's see. This one had the blower fans, or the suction fans, and the well. Mm-hmm. There was the well, and was in the corner of here. This had the fans. What these big old blower fans did underneath these kilns is all undermined.
Okay.
Now, tunnels under them, deep tunnels, and it actually sucked the air. When they burned the kilns, the air went into the fire bags and then down the tunnels and out the stacks, burning. When they shut them down, they drafted the air out the bottom of the kilns. They would shut off the damper that went to this, so it didn't suck the air back down the stack. And then they would blow it down, they would suck that air back the other way. And so the fans were in here to draw the air, and that brought the air back, and this is the dryer building.
Okay.
And that's where the cars, after they were made, the greenware was put on rail cars, little rails, and they used to push them out of here and into here and down to the back of here. And then they shoved the cars into here, and they were stacked in here. And the heat from these going down, the heat, they would suck that heat into this dryer building and maintain the dryers till that stuff dried and got all the moisture out of it. And then they'd bring the cars over through back here in the transfer track and up through here and out through the rail. Little rail went down through here. Mm-hmm. And then they bring them little cars, and they had little rails going in between each one, so they brought the cars in so they could bring the greenware and the driedware out into the kilns. Mm-hmm. And then they added this on. This was the new building for the tunnel kiln, the part of it. This was new when they built the tunnel kiln.
Okay.
And they built the tunnel kiln. And so they would actually bring the greenware, then, the wetware, after it's manufactured, into here, and they'd transfer it down into here, and it went into the dryers, and then they'd bring them out of the dryers, see this connector here, they'd bring the little cars out of here, and bring them back into here, and line them up in here on the rail, and there was a rail all the way down through this building. The tunnel kiln. And back here there was a hydraulic ram. If you picture a long hydraulic cylinder, they'd put the cars and transform onto the rails, and the hydraulic cylinder was way back, and then it would come ahead real slow and gather them up, and this hydraulic ram moved them real slow down through here all the time. And eventually they would come out down into this building here, and they would back the semis into here, and they would load the stuff out of the tunnel kiln. That's how this whole apparatus worked here. And this was the ram for the tunnel kiln. And this was the beginning of the tunnel kiln. Mm-hmm. Excuse my spelling, I just scribbled. And this was getting in, this area here was probably the higher heat. See, it gradually raised up, and that's why they had this raised up as they could let some of the heat. And this was the beginning of the heat zone. And then the high heat. And this was beginning of the cooling.
Okay.
And then this was a loadout. And this is where they backed in. I don't know what that, well, they'd bring the semis out here and they would back them in. Back in the trucks there. Okay, smokestack, that kind of explains. This was the electric transformer.
Okay.
It was this here. And this was the office. Main office. And they worked over there, and Jim Ernst and them worked in here. This was the shop.
Okay.
Repair shop. And they also had a repair shop there and inside of here too. Right here they had another shop. Maybe you can read that, I hope you can. Okay, where am I at now? Beehives, they explain themselves kind of. This was, they called the doghouse.
Okay.
And rather than call it the doghouse, let's call it the burner house. That's where the burners. And that's where they had all of they monitored all of the heat for all of these kilns. They had a little telephone pole sticking up and they brought the wires over to this doghouse, and this was the monitor where they monitored the heat of the kilns. They'd go in there and turn the dial and they could tell how hot it was and which ones had to be brought more up to heat or which ones were cooling down. You didn't dare open them up right away when they was extremely hot, or the air would rush and the stuff would break. Cold. You know how the cold air has an effect on things. That's the burner house with the gauges. I'll put width gauges so they could monitor the heating. Oh, let me think now. This is where the road come in. The road come in here, and they had. This is the truck where we used to park the trailers. Parking. You could see the semis and stuff parked around down in here. This was the old coal chute. C-H-U-T, or how do you spell that type of chute?
C-H-U-T, I think.
C-H-U-T, chute. Coal chute. That was a coal. They used that to unload box cars. They'd haul it in by rail and they'd unload it into here. In the early days when I first started, and then they had an old dump truck would go down here and load the kilns, load it with the coal, and then he'd dump it around the kilns. Just dump a load of it at locations around the kilns, and then the guys that had to burn the coal, they'd come around with a shovel and shovel it into the fire bags on the kilns. And this is all stockpile.
Okay.
All stockpiles down to here, to there. And I believe that was before they built the other beehives over on the other side. See, they still had the box cars. See the row of box cars getting ready to load? Mm-hmm. These are box cars all lined up there. And this was just a parking lot. We used to back the semis. We used to get so good at it, we'd back all the way around in through and back the semis and between the kilns. That was just a parking lot.
So those burners, the kilns were burning 24/7.
Yeah, once they start them, once they get done with them, they put the wares in, and the setters they're called. They had to stack the tile off of the cars and stack it, and they had the little rails. They had to get the rails inside the kiln, see, and they'd start way on the back side and bring the little cars in on rails. And then as they got it stacked, they'd have to take a section of rail out. They had little links, you know, and they'd take out a section, so you had to remove the rail as you backed out of the kilns. See, and then lay them off to the side. And you had to carry the rails over to other kilns when you got them ready to refill. And then when you got them way full, the doorways were mudded up. They called it mudded up. They'd take old block, you know, fire brick and lay in the doorways and mortar them together, and then take a coating of mud, fire clay, and mud the doors shut, seal them. And then they built the fires gradually inside, you know, the fire boxes. The kiln, you've seen the kilns, and they got a firebox. I don't know how many, 6 or 8 fireboxes. And these kilns are all undermined underneath. And so they would, you know, you put the coal in the fire bag, and then this old smokestack, he's a sucking air, you know. And so the draft is going down, right, under the kilns. So when he built a fire in here, this heat goes up. So the heat would come up to the dome out of all these here, you know, boxes. And little by little, they would increase the heat. And how they did that, they had big dampers where, you know, the tunnels run underneath. They had dampers.
Okay.
And they would raise this big hunk of steel on a lever, and it would bring the damper up and let the air, you know, suck. And that caused, you know, the fire to gradually build inside the dome, and it got hotter and hotter and hotter, and that's what they monitored in this little doghouse.
So they had to have guys there all the time.
Oh yeah, the burners was 24/7.
What kind of shifts did they have then?
They had an 8-hour shift.
8 hours.
3 shifts, you know, I think that run that.
Okay.
And that was extra money for burners that worked nights, you know, to take care of that. But they had to monitor the burning schedules. And then they also had to monitor the ones that were going down in heat by regulating the dampers, you know, and they'd go in and watch their, you know, the temperature gauges and regulate the dampers to suck. Either these fans would go on or leave them on, and they'd regulate the dampers out here to suck so much into this drying building, and you know, to cool them down. And they'd monitor, you know, the temperature. And sometimes when they got in a hurry to empty kilns because they wanted to get production going, sometimes they'd go inside the kilns and start emptying them when it was really hot yet. You couldn't wear any metal when you was inside the kilns. I went in once with a watch on, metal watch, and the heat was so bad that it blistered my hand. You know, you couldn't, but you had a big old air fan that once you got the door open and it was cooled down, you'd set this big air fan out and it would blow air, so you had moving air. But if that ever was, you know, electricity went off on that, you had to get out there, you know. And you couldn't stand it in there. But that's pretty much, and then this was stockpile block down here. This is a stockpile. This is block. This is where they had the, you know, the brick and block and stuff, but the brick was in some of these piles too. And then we loaded these out, we're bringing the semis in and back in alongside the piles, and we loaded off the pile down to a certain height, and when they got down to the bottom, you had to pick the bottom up and you had to put it up on the semi, and then the guys would take it there and stack it on the trucks. This was the brick building, import brick building, where we kept most of the import bricks. Shall I put that on there? Import brick building. And other things, we carried junctions in there too, for junctions for the drain tile and old coal chute. This was the trucks in the parking lot, and they had some stuff kind of piled up around down there and there too, and that was the trucks. That was a coal chute, and this was brick. This was the tunnel kiln. This was just stockpile stuff down in here. This was a clay pit down this way. You can see that where they used to dig the clay. And a production building, Cramway, and it was really went down. Electric transformers and the smokestacks, they speak for themselves. I think, you know, this was all stockpile stuff both ways. Parking lot, and Jim and the Galvins, they always parked their cars over in here, the ones that worked in the office. They had an office in this building.
Okay.
Well, I'm going to draw an arrow down to it, but there was the plant office. The dispatcher was in there, the guy that used to dispatch and take orders, you know, and somebody would come in with the truck to get tile, they'd go to his office. This was the main office where the bookkeepers and management, this was the
That was more like the company office, while the other one was just
the plant office. The company management main office building, and, you know, the bookkeepers. And this was, you know, the supervisor's office, dispatcher. But the Burners, their home was here. I mean, this is where their office, the Burners, they spent all their time in this little building here and then walking around monitoring things. But there was a plant office, and one day we had a gas pump right in front of this building, and we had a gas semi, and I was gassing up right there, and I heard a crash, and I turned around, and there was a chunk of this fell out, and it fell right into this office, right through the windows.
I thought I saw a picture of that.
Yeah, and it left a jagged, and I stood there, and I couldn't move. This whole side had fallen out. And as I looked, this thing began to crumble above where the side come out, and then it kind of twisted, and it leaned, and then it kind of just did this. Because of the weight, it broke loose underneath, and I couldn't manage the weight. So instead of just falling over, like it would have stayed real strong, it would have fell, you know, like a tree or something. But see, it just breaks loose, and then it crumbles. And those blocks were approximately that big of squares. This main force of it went right through the office. Jim Ernst was in there. He just died. Jim did. You remember? And he was in there. I was scared to death that he was dead. And I waited till the dust settled. He couldn't see nothing. And I went running and digging. I was hollering, you know, we need some help. And some guy come running in from back here, and he says, if you're looking for Jim Ernst, he went that way about 90 miles an hour. He just knew. He just, and it took that whole office, like there was his front windows, and those stuff come through, and it just pushed everything in there. Just like a landslide. Yeah. If he hadn't got out, he'd been dead. But
did they ever rebuild it then?
No, they never did rebuild it. What they did then, they put in this blower. They added another big fan to do this sucking part that, you know, the smokestack actually draws, and it makes a draft up it. They put in big old blower fans, and this one went down eventually too. In the beginning, they had a number of them little, you know, the stacks, but they did away with them because, you know, they kept building more kilns. I don't know what else I can add to that.
You talked a little bit about the waste. Was that ever ground up and reused?
Green waste that had not been burnt, they reground that. Green waste unburned. By unburned, it wasn't made into clay or hard clay or hard burn clay. They did have a grinding. They did grind a little bit of it to mix back in. But no, they never really went into a lot of people came and got it and hauled it out for their own use and stuff like that. And if you drove over it, you know, with something, it would break up, you know, to a certain amount, but it always stayed kind of big. But I always thought there might have been a need for that. If you'd had a hammer mill, could have ground it up and made like a gravel, more like a gravel out of it, and so it would, you know, pack better and so forth. But no, they never did. They just, this whole area down here by the river is just all that waste. There's just tons and tons of it where they dumped and dumped and dumped along the river down in there and stuff. So no, they never utilized that waste. It was just waste. You got to understand, when you get it from the ground, you don't actually buy the, you know, what you're using to begin with. You actually dig it you know? So your cost is not, it ain't like buying steel from somebody and then turning the steel into other products. You're digging it out of the ground, so it just goes back to waste, you know? Interesting place. I learned a lot while I worked here. I did a lot of jobs. Good place to work. That took care of me for that many years anyway, and I needed it. Yep. Yep.